Have you ever been in a situation when a seemingly small mistake ended up costing you greatly? It happened to me. I didn't even have any fucking clue that it will turn out to be like this. Trust is very important for any relationship. It takes a lot of effort to build this trust and very little to break it. I made the mistake of breaking it, and I regret that. Till this date. I, female 36, married to my husband, male 40. We have been married for 2 years. My husband is a professor in our local university. I am an assistant professor in the same university. I joined this university 3 years back. The pay was really good, and the working hours were also less compared to my previous place of work. My husband is a senior professor in this university. He is well respected there. I met my husband in university when I was hired as an assistant professor to work under him. My husband was present during my interviews. I developed an instant crush on him. He was smart and fun. I was over the moon when I was hired to work under him as his assistant. We had to work in close proximity as our work demanded that. I used to attend his classes with him and also corrected test papers after work together. Working together worked in our favor. We used to hang out a lot with each other. One thing led to another, and we started going on dates together. Our relationship started with small talks and casual jokes. We soon started having lunch together and spending more and more time with each other. The attraction was mutual, and it wasn't long before we got in a relationship with each other. After being together for a year, my husband asked me to marry him. I liked being with him. He was well respected in the college. He spoke with certain authority. All that had me really falling for him. I loved the way he cared for me. I told him yes, and we got married in a small wedding ceremony. Our married life was going well. I had moved in with him in his small bungalow. We were happy together. Our life was going great. We used to work together and then got to come home together. I was happy and content in my marriage. I felt like I had everything I ever wanted. My husband was the perfect alpha male. He was strong, confident, and charismatic. He knew what he wanted and how to get it. I admired him for his intelligence and hardworking nature. I felt like we were a perfect match, but soon I lost him. A year into our marriage, I made a small mistake that ended up costing me everything. It was a mistake that I didn't even think twice about when I made it, but the consequences that followed were unimaginable. I wish I could rectify that mistake. It all started with a new assistant professor who had joined our university. Let's call him George. George was around the same age as me. George was charming, confident, and, to be honest, very attractive. I had casually talked to him a few times before, but it was nothing out of the ordinary. However, one day, when my husband was out of town and I was working from a cafe near the university, me and George happened to bump into each other. We both ordered coffee and started chatting. The conversation was lighthearted and fun. We discussed everything from work to our personal lives. George was single and had just moved into the town. He was very easy to talk to, and before I knew it, a few hours had passed. We exchanged numbers and promised to keep in touch. I didn't think much of it at the time. I enjoyed talking to George, but I was happily married to my husband. Little did I know my small mistake of exchanging numbers with George would lead to a series of events that would turn my life upside down. Over the course of the next few weeks, George and I started texting each other. Initially, it was just casual conversations about work and our interests. But soon, our conversations became more flirtatious. I couldn't believe it at first. I was pretty sure that everyone was aware that I was married and who my husband was. George started sending me flirty text messages which were subtle. I could have ignored it if I wanted to, but I didn't. I responded back to him in a flirty way too. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. I would text him only when my husband wasn't around, as I couldn't risk my husband finding this out. I was just having fun with texts. I didn't think I was doing anything very wrong. One day, my husband and I got into a really big fight. He wanted a baby, whereas I told him that I wasn't ready yet. We already had this discussion, and I had told him that I didn't want a baby. Having a baby came with a lot of responsibilities. I didn't think I was at that point of time where I was ready for those responsibilities. I tried to make my husband understand this, but he was too furious to listen. He said some really hurtful words to me. He told me that it was in my nature to run away from responsibilities. It made me very upset and sad. He left the house to get some space from me. I was home alone. The fight left me feeling upset and vulnerable. And that's when George messaged me, asking if I wanted to grab a drink with him. I hesitated, but the temptation was too strong, so I agreed to meet him. My husband needed his space away from me, so it was fine that I was taking my space too. I thought to myself as I texted George that I was down for meeting that night. We went to a bar far away from the university. It was on the outskirts of the town, so there were slim chances that I would run into someone who would recognize me there. The bar had an amazing atmosphere. The dim lights and soft music set the perfect mood for a night out. The drinks were flowing, and the conversation was light and fun. But then things started to get a little out of hand. I got very drunk that night. I ordered multiple shots of vodka. George was by my side throughout the night. We were flirting with each other continuously. It started to feel like we were the only two people in the world. I forgot about my fight with my husband. It was nice to be away from the stress of my marriage for a while. The chemistry between me and George was undeniable, and it was unlike anything I had ever felt before. That night, I cheated on my husband. George came out to drop me to my cab. We stood there and waited for my cab to come. We were waiting on the pavement when he kissed me. He gave me enough time and space to back out, but I didn't. I kissed him back. I was so drunk that I didn't realize anything till the next morning. I woke up with a terrible hangover the next morning. It took me some time to realize what had happened last night. My kiss with George came back to memory, and I instantly thought, fuck, what had I done? I went out of the bedroom and found my husband at the kitchen counter. He was quite calmer than yesterday. He asked me where I was last night. I told him that I went out with my friends. He nodded to that and then said sorry for our fight that happened the previous day. He told me that he'll give me as much time as I want and there's no hurry to have a baby. He just couldn't wait to grow our family. I was instantly consumed by the guilt of what I had done last night. I kissed another man when my husband was dreaming of growing our family together. It was just a kiss, but still. It was a mistake that I deeply regretted, but there was no going back now. I knew I had made a grave error in judgment, and the regret consumed me. I wanted to come clean and tell my husband, but I was too scared of his reaction. I was terrified that he might find out about my mistake and leave me. I knew him. He wasn't the type of man who would let something like this slide. I saw text messages from George when I went to my bedroom. There were texts from him the previous night asking me if I had reached home safe. There were also texts about how he really enjoyed our kiss and would like to see me again. I immediately blocked him. The guilt of not being honest with my husband weighed heavily on me every day. I loved my husband, and I knew that if he found out the truth, it would break his heart. But still, I couldn't bring myself to tell him what had happened between George and me. Every night I lay awake in bed motionless, reliving the moment I made my mistake. The guilt and fear were heavy like a physical weight, crushing my chest. It had been weeks since that day, but I still didn't have the courage to tell my husband what I had done. My throat seemed to close up every time I tried to form the words. So I decided to keep it a secret. I tried to act normal in front of my husband for the next few weeks. But every time he touched me, every time he kissed me, I felt like a fraud. I felt like I was deceiving him. I was living a lie. I was stuck in this limbo of guilt and fear until one day, George came to the seminar conducted by my department. My husband was the speaker in this event. As soon as I saw George, my heart sank. He knew what we had done, and he could easily reveal the truth if he wanted to. Fortunately for me, he didn't say anything about that night or even acknowledge me in any way. He kept his distance throughout his time on campus, never once giving me an indication that he remembered our secret kiss from months ago. I was relieved that he hadn't said anything about us, but at the same time, my guilt only intensified even further. It felt like a ticking time bomb waiting to go off at any moment. The day finally came when everything fell apart. It was a Monday morning and I was running late for work. I had a meeting with one of my colleagues and I was already 10 minutes late. I quickly grabbed my bag and rushed out of the house. I got in my car and started driving towards the university. As I was driving, I realized that I had left my phone at home. I panicked for a moment, but I decided to keep going. I knew that I would be late for my meeting, but I didn't want to turn back and risk being even later. My husband didn't have anything scheduled for the morning. He was going to come separately before his afternoon meeting. When I finally arrived at the university, I rushed to my meeting. It was a productive meeting, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. As soon as the meeting was over, I rushed to my office. When I opened the door, I saw my husband sitting at my desk. He had my phone in his hand, and he was scrolling through my messages. I froze. I knew at that moment that everything was about to come crashing down. My small mistake had finally caught up with me. My husband looked up at me with a look of betrayal in his eyes. I felt like the biggest fool in the world. He stood up and handed me my phone. "Why did you do it?" he asked me, his voice barely above a whisper. He had scrolled through my text messages with George. He read all our text messages where he flirted with me and I flirted back. He also mentioned the kiss in the texts. I had no words to say. I knew that there was no justification for what I had done. All I could do was hang my head in shame and wait for whatever was to come. My husband told me how he knew something was wrong when I started avoiding him in the last weeks. He told me that he had thought I was still upset about the baby thing, and that's why he was giving me space. "I never thought you'd betray me like this," he said to me. My husband didn't say anything else. He simply left my office, leaving me alone with my guilt and shame. I knew that I had lost his trust, and I didn't know if I would ever be able to earn it back. I sat at my desk for what felt like hours, numb with shock and regret. I had destroyed the one thing that mattered most to me, my marriage, and all because of a stupid kiss. I went home after some time. I needed to explain to my husband that it was a mistake and that I really loved him. My husband was sitting on the couch in the living room drinking his whiskey. I went to him to hold him and explain to him what had happened, but he rejected my touch and pushed me away. His eyes were cold and distant, and I could feel the anger radiating off of him. I knew that I had hurt him deeply, and there was nothing I could do to make it right. I felt an urgent need to explain everything to him. I told him how it was just a kiss, and that happened only because I was extremely drunk. He looked at me with so much anger but didn't say anything to me. He left the house after my confession. For the next few days, my husband barely spoke to me. It was like I didn't exist. I begged him for his forgiveness, but he refused to even look at me. I felt like a ghost wandering without any purpose through our home. Days turned into weeks with my husband and I living together but barely speaking. The air between us was thick with tension and unsaid words that hung like a loaded gun. I tried to reach out to him, but he kept pushing me away, refusing to even look at me. Everything I tried went in vain. I tried to hug him while he was sleeping, but he rejected my touch. For a while, I thought that we could work things out if I just kept putting efforts to earn his forgiveness. I thought that we could talk about what had happened and find a way to move forward, but it seemed like my husband had already made up his mind about what he wanted to do. One day, he came to me and told me that he wanted to talk about something. Hope blossomed as I sat there to listen to his words. I thought that maybe he has finally forgiven me and wants to make things all right again. He immediately crushed all the hope when he asked me to leave the house. He told me that he needed some space to think about things. He said it was hard for him to think with a clear mind when I'm in the same house as him. I was devastated. I couldn't believe that it had come to this. I didn't fight his decision. A small part of me hoped that maybe if we stayed away for a while, he would miss me and everything would get back to normal. I rented a small apartment in town and moved out of our home. It was really hard for me to leave the house. I didn't pack all of my stuff as I had hoped that I was going to come back and live here with him again. I moved to the apartment. It was a lonely existence there without my husband. I spent most of my days in tears, regretting everything that had happened. Or I would try to escape everything by getting lost in my work. I had requested work from home because I was too depressed to face the world. Work was a good distraction until I lost it too. One day, I got a call from the head of my department telling me that I was immediately terminated from my job. I was stunned. It felt like everything was falling apart in my life. My marriage, my home, and now my career. I had poured my heart and soul into my work.